Зараз проходить вступні онлайн чи на корпус? Треба їх на корпус. На таксі. Ну, як? Що робити? Речі, десь чи не докласти? Це да. Краще в Києві залишитися. Це менше. І цілий рік я вже коротше завантажений. Якщо ти плануєш зараз щось робити, то не можна якось прислати загадки цієї школи. Але легше сказати, що я розумію, як саме не сам вступав, я виконував ці договори. Я вступав на першому, не пройшов. І я крупний. У мене вже тоді було я це розумію. Це не спробувати, що ти будеш
Hello everyone. Hello everyone. Very happy to welcome you to our evening session, which actually is a presentation of a marvelous book, which is here by the author, who is also here, and we are very happy to welcome Victoria Donovan, who has changed her credentials a bit in the recent years, and we are so happy that now she's a professor of Ukrainian and East European Studies and Director of Center for Global Post-Socialism at University of St. Andrews. Like before, it was more like modern languages and Russian language something department. So we are super happy that institutions are changing, but Victoria stays for many years as a very good friend of the center and our partner in many projects which are about research, but also about public history, archiving, support for vulnerable archives and communities and heritage, especially in the Ukrainian East, which will be actually the topic to talk about today. The book is also available at the library of the center, so we welcome you all, of course, to read it and to actually see, to touch physically also this story, because I think in many senses this book is also about bodily experiences of history and heritage. So this is a book which combines academic approach, academic look and ideas, but also personal experiences of Victoria traveling to Ukrainian East, conversations with many people who come from local cultural milieu, and just many other people from the region, but also beyond, people who are interested in Ukrainian East. So I think reading physical book will be a very good gesture to continue this kind of experiential approach to how you first encounter, talk to people, how you are brave to be physically present during the full-scale invasion and before the full-scale invasion in Ukraine. And please, if anyone else needs translation, you can put the earphones on. So there is Sophia owning and offering the technical equipment for this. And please be ready, and we welcome your questions, comments, but please also take the microphone for this, because we have a translation, and we of course are very grateful to the translator, and we will try to be not very fast, talking very clearly. And please use the microphone so the translator can do her work. Now I think we will organize this session in a way that we will have a lucky chance to hear to Victoria's introduction about the most important aspects of her work. Then I will maybe start with some of the questions for discussion, and then we welcome you all to take part.
Thank you so much. Is this microphone okay, or do you need me to use the other one? This one okay? So thank you so much. I've done a lot of book talks already, but this is my first book talk in Ukraine, and I'm so honored to have it here with Irina, my long-term friend and collaborator, and to be present once again in this amazing institution, and to be also together with you, students of the Invisible University, who are, I hear, some of the sharpest critics, and will give the best feedback on the book. I wanted to, and thank you so much for inviting me and for everything we continue to do together and have done in the past. So I've got quite an ambitious agenda, because Irina told me I only had half an hour, but I'll try and squeeze it all in. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about some of the methodological thinking behind the book, and then to talk to you about the book itself. but the thinking is also connected with all of the projects that we realized collaboratively with Irina and colleagues together. So we just heard from Irina, but we'll potentially hear from her again because I have a short video as well which features her. Okay, so let me start with the book and some anxieties that I had about writing a book about Ukraine, not being from Ukraine, and not having any family heritage in Ukraine, but having an academic interest. And some of the questions that I had for myself when I was writing this book about how you can write in a way that is ethical, that doesn't extract local knowledge and use it for your own benefit without giving anything back to the communities that you've taken that knowledge from, and how you can write in a way that represents that knowledge to broader communities in a way that is helpful and productive during wartime. And I think these questions emerge a bit from my concerns about some ways in which academic knowledge has been produced in the past. Although there are many brilliant books that have been produced with ethical collaborative methods that I admire, and I don't mean to sort of suggest that everything that has come before has been extractivist, so I should say that straight away. But sometimes I think there is a tendency to work in academia in a way that kind of has direct benefit for the academic, potentially at a Western institution like mine, very privileged with a lot of money, St Andrews, to kind of go somewhere that perhaps, and to work with institutions that might not be as well resourced as the university that you come from, to benefit a lot from working with those institutions and those communities, and then to go back to your privileged university to write up a book, to get promoted, say, and not even perhaps think about having the book translated or doing anything that would kind of bring the benefit of that sort of knowledge extraction back to the communities. And since I'm working on the Ukrainian East and thinking a lot about historic extractivisms, industrial extraction, I also began to think about these questions of academic extractivism when the benefit is taken elsewhere and it doesn't return to the places where the goods have been taken. Before I return to those questions and to how I tried to answer them in my book, I want to take you back to the very beginning of this research. Actually, the reason why I first came to the Centre for Urban History in 2016, it was to work on this history, the history of Huzovka, or Yuzivka in Ukrainian, which is a history that links the region that I come from, South Wales in the United Kingdom, to eastern Ukraine. And I wrote up an application to the residency programme about how I wanted to research this history with very little knowledge about how much had already been done, and thinking that I was probably proposing something new and innovative, but ultimately it brought me here, and it brought me to a group of people who were working on this already in amazing ways, and we began to work together. So I imagine many of you in this room know about this history. When I talk to other audiences, they haven't got a clue, but I imagine most people here will have heard of Yuzivka. But I didn't know when I began to work in the Glamorgan archives in Cardiff, which is the city that I was born in, that there was this historic link through labour migration between South Wales and eastern Ukraine. Oh yeah, of course, sorry. I didn't know about these links between South Wales and eastern Ukraine. And the links are to do with industry. In the late 19th century, Welsh industrialists and capitalists went to today's Donetsk, and they founded a company town there, partnering with Russian imperial business elites, and they began a process of industrial acceleration. There was already industry in the region, but they brought a lot of additional capital and technology. Here you can see them dragging a boiler across the steppe. That's a British boiler that came from London, I believe. And this photograph was produced by a Welsh chemist called Percy Cartwright, and they're dragging that boiler to Yuzivka, today's Donetsk. And around a couple of hundred Welsh labour migrants moved in about 1869 what's today's eastern Ukraine, and they settled there, and some of them stayed there for several generations, having children and marrying with a kind of local people, integrating in a way, although they always lived in quite sort of colonial, segregated conditions from the local workforce, until 1917. Well, partly before 1917, so they began to leave, but in 1917 they all pretty much left, and the industries were nationalized, and the story of sort of the Soviet expansion of the Ukrainian East began. So this is a history that I had very little idea about when I first found out about it in the archives in Cardiff, and it was something that really immediately shocked me, because I come from this region but yet had never heard about this history, and also I work on the history of Russian imperialism and Soviet history. And so my question was why? Why don't I know about this? People in Ukraine knew about it, but people in South Wales had no idea. And I have my theories about why. I think partly it's to do with the fact that when we tell histories of industry and labour history in Wales, it's always from the point of view of being a victim of the neoliberal kind of destruction of industry under Margaret Thatcher. So this victim of kind of neoliberal expansion is the story that we tell ourselves, and we don't really tell ourselves this story about Wales being included in these sort of extractivist imperial, semi-imperial politics that were exploiting other communities for economic profit. So I wanted to do something with this history, but not necessarily write an academic article. And I wanted to do something with local communities. So what I did, working with artists and communities in South Wales, was to organise a festival where we exhibited the archival documents from the Husovka Research Archive, which included really quite remarkable kind of documents, the sorts of things that you love to find as a cultural historian. Family letters from Lysychansk back home to South Wales, portraits, people's birth certificates, letters of reference, but also many kinds of memoirs and diaries of the Welsh people who had moved to the Ukrainian steppe and were sometimes having a horrible time and didn't like it very much, and were trying to recreate for themselves trappings of British life, like tea circles, amateur dramatics clubs, and other kinds of things that made themselves feel at home. So we showed some of these archival materials in South Wales, but 2017, yeah. So this was just after the Brexit vote, when the UK had voted to leave the European Union. So I also wanted to put this history of Welsh labour migration from west to east into dialogue with these very toxic discourses around labour migration from Eastern Europe to the UK, which had in part powered the decision to leave the European Union. And so we invited local people from migrant communities who were resident in South Wales at that time to join us in the exhibition and to sort of contribute their own sort of whatever they wanted to do there. So lots of people did crafts and culinary culinary traditions, and we kind of celebrated this theme of migration whilst also exploring some of the complexities that kind of inform decisions to move from one place to the next. And this was my first experience working with communities and with artists to explore history, but also to kind of create something new, be it a sense of community or a different kind of understanding or some new kind of creativity in response to history and archives. And I really enjoyed it, and I definitely knew that I would do it again and wanted to do more. So the next thing that we did together with my PhD student at the time, Daria Cymbaluk, was to organise a summer school in eastern Ukraine where we would work with some of these same methods, archives, history, but also with local communities and landscapes. And we went to Kyiv and to Severodonetsk and Lysychansk in 2019 with a group of students and researchers and artists. And we worked with some of this sort of history and heritage of industry and kind of innovated projects and thinking around that history. This is a picture of us on a trip to the Fox Beam Lysychansk, which is one of the first places where coal was mined in Donbas, in Lysychansk. And we did lots of these kinds of trips to places which were linked with historic industry there. And it was, again, a really remarkable experience that really kind of impressed me and convinced me that I wanted to do more of this community engaged kind of history exploration and to do my research in this collaborative way that engaged different kinds of knowledge holders and not just academics. So I began to think about this a little bit more academically, thinking about, in particular, the research around reciprocal ethnography and collaborative methods, which I hadn't really dealt with very much before. This is kind of often feminist literature and decolonial literature that looks at the way in which you can sort of destabilize this often academic hierarchy between the researcher and the research subject and create research in collaboration with communities to create it with them rather than about them. And I really enjoyed this literature, it really resonated with me, and I knew that this was kind of the way in which I would want to do my research in the future, kind of in collaboration with people, and to have them involved from the very inception of a project in kind of designing the research questions, thinking about the methods and how we work together, and also to design outputs that wouldn't just benefit me as an academic, but would also have kind of broader benefits for them in the various fields and places that they worked. So we started then in 2020 another project where we tried to put some of this literature into practice. So this was during COVID, so it was mostly online and none of us were going anywhere, so it was a good time to experiment with different kinds of methods of knowledge production. And again, it was me and my then PhD student, who you can see at the top, and then quite a few artists from the Luhansk and Donetsk regions. And the idea of this project was that the artists would kind of present, we were interested in the way artistic representations of the history and contemporary life in eastern Ukraine. But we wanted to have the artists involved in the production of the knowledge, not just to kind of just be looking at their work and writing about it, but to do it in a different way. So the way that we did it was we asked them to present their projects, and then we wrote field notes about them, and we gave the field notes to the artists, and the artists criticized them using track changes and Google Docs, and said, you know, you've got this wrong, yeah, like this is exoticizing, you know, I didn't mean that when I said that. And then sent them back to us. It involved working across different languages as well. And then ultimately it gained such a momentum, and we had so many kind of different sorts of documents kind of going back and forth, and so many different projects and visual works that were being exchanged that we decided to turn it into a book rather than an article. So we wrote this book together called Limits of Collaboration, Art, Ethics and Donbas. Which was together with the artists Viktor Kovic-Sasibkin, Alexander Kuchinsky, Katarina Sirik, and Dmitro Chepodny, sorry I missed him out at the beginning. And that book kind of explored some of these collaborative methods, and it was very experimental, and it was a little bit chaotic, but I think it's kind of cool, and it involves lots of different kinds of texts, so interviews and dialogues with the artists, but also these field notes directly included, and then ultimately the academic article that we wrote. So we tried to kind of really show the process of doing this collaborative research, which I should say was not easy. It involves a lot of labour to work in that way. It's much easier to work in a traditional academically extractivist way and to write your article based on some observations that you've had. This took a really long time, and it was also quite sort of, at moments, quite tense, because you exchange kind of ideas about representation, and you know, like you kind of have different positionalities and different kinds of privilege. So it was a difficult process of making this book. But in the introduction to it, we theorize it as feminist labor, which is difficult and often sweaty and often invisible. And so this is the way in which we were working and trying to kind of destabilize some of those ways in which you write as an academic. And then in the middle of this book being published, it was actually half published in a publishing house in Kiev. It's available actually open access online, so you can read this online. But we also had 500 copies which were published. But in the middle of this being published, the full-scale invasion happened, and the book actually got stuck in the publishing house. The kind of main body of it was published, but the cover hadn't been published, and then it got stuck for months there while the Russian troops were kind of invading from the north, and obviously Kiev publishing house stopped, and then when the Ukrainian army pushed them back, then the book was finished, and it was a real war book. And so when that happened, we were like everybody, you know, in various ways and in different places, completely sort of paralysed and distraught, and we wondered what we could do, what would be of benefit at this point. So we decided to have an exhibition with colleagues to raise money for the artists who were in the book, many of whom were then displaced. At the St Andrew's Botanical Garden, there were also a lot of Ukrainian refugees arriving in Scotland at that time, so this was a kind of amazing opportunity to welcome them with some images by artists from the places that they'd come from. It was a very emotional exhibition, and we managed to raise a lot of money to kind of contribute at that time. And yeah, this is just an image of some of the people who were involved in that. And then I wanted just briefly to talk about our project together, if you don't mind, Irina, which was kind of running simultaneous to this, and also used many of the same collaborative community-engaged methods to produce knowledge with the communities rather than about them. And this is very much part of the methodology that I really admire about the Centre for Urban History, is the way in which they don't just do these archiving projects, but are genuinely committed in a way that isn't just virtue signalling and trying to kind of make themselves look good as a brand, to the process of engaging communities in the processing of these materials and in the way in which they're then kind of perceived and presented to outsiders. So in a true collaborative sense, I wanted just to play our video, if that's okay, and to just give Irina the word, albeit by the video for a second, to tell you about the Unarchiving Post-Industry project, because I understand that she hasn't mentioned it already and it definitely deserves to be mentioned. So I'll just hand over to Irina for a moment.
Індустріальна історія взагалі є важливою в формуванні сучасної Європи, але після занепаду індустрії підприємства дуже часто більше не підтримують свої архіви, і вони, на жаль, гинуть. І так виникла ідея проєкту розархівування постіндустрії, вся ідея якого полягала в тому, щоб оцифрувати матеріали і дати їм нове життя. Ми об'єдналися із партнерами з університету St Andrews у Шотландії, а також з кількома музеями в східноукраїнському регіоні, дуже індустріальному Донбасі. Це був Покровський історичний музей, Маріупольський краєзнавчий, музей у Краматорську.
За підтримки наших європейських партнерів House of Europe та JTRF ми оголосили про безкоштовний збір матеріалів для оцифрування. Нам було важливо зібрати і інституційні матеріали колекцій з краєзнавчих музеїв, історичних, але так само і ті матеріали, які зберігаються в родинах, які недоступні для дослідників. Ми не знали, чи люди будуть готові ділитися своїми матеріалами, адже в той час цей регіон поставив перед викликом війни, яка почалася в 2014 році. Але відгук був активним, великим. Нам вдалося зібрати та оцифрувати більш як 30 тисяч фотографій та більше 100 кіноплівок. Ці матеріали зараз оцифровані і доступні на нашому сайті. Ще частина є в роботі, ми їх описуємо в співпраці разом з власниками.
Також ми їх промотували далі в таких формах, як виставки, і також була низка таких спільнотних семінарів, зокрема в Евувейл в Уельсі, в Веслосі в Шотландії і в англійському Даремі, а також літня школа в шахтарському місті Покровськ на Донбасі, де, власне, митці разом із учасниками, дослідниками і архівістами розробляли свої власні проекти навколо цих матеріалів. початком повномасштабного вторгнення Росії в Україну наш проект зазнав драматичних змін. Наприклад, один із членів команди пішов воювати як солдат, і він навіть звільняв місця, про які він вивчав в своїй роботі в проєкті. Ще інші колеги залишаються під окупацією. Багато хто змушений був тікати і став переміщеними особами. Але ми продовжуємо оцифровувати матеріали. Ми прагнемо, щоб повоєнна відбудова могла скористатися цими матеріалами, але також вже сьогодні ці матеріали через онлайн-простір працюють на об'єднання людей. Вони можуть сягати до цієї спадщини і маючи надію на те краще майбутнє, яке вони зможуть побудувати, спираючись на свою спадщину, свою гідність, свою історію.
Yeah, so I think that incredible work that was led by the Centre for Urban History and in which we supported speaks for itself. But as Irina explains in the video, this was a digitization project which led to the creation of open access digital archives that you can work with through the Urban Media Archive. It involved various kinds of amazing community engagement work, including the home movie days that were which featured the kind of home video of local communities who were able to contextualize and present their own work and be in control of the way in which that work was received and understood by audiences. Summer schools, as Irina mentioned, including a summer school in Pokrovsk, which was really incredible in 2021. Artwork that was produced as a result of many of those summer schools. These are works by Alexander Kuchinsky and Anna Pilipiuk and Volodymyr Shipotilnikov that came out of work with the archives from the Pokrovsk and the Mariupol local history museums, and various workshops that took place in the UK, including in West Lothian in Scotland, where we did a photography workshop with young people on the terikoni of the oil shell industry, the slag heaps, creating new art, work with local communities in this former steelmaking town of Vale, where we worked with the Mariupol steelworks archives and created kind of opportunities to make connections between those contexts. Work with creative writing, with local communities, working with heritage. And this sort of work on anti-extractivist and collaborative methods really kind of made me think that this was the way that we could use this more in our research in general. And so I wrote quite a number of articles about these kinds of methods and the projects that we'd run together, and tried to kind of bring that in a methodological sense to broader audiences. So this isn't new work, of course. That people have been working on kind of various types of collaborative practice, particularly in anthropology, for many years. But in the sphere that I work in, modern languages and cultural studies, it doesn't tend to be a very popular research method. So it's potentially, I think, something new there. Is that okay? Sorry? Doesn't matter. Okay, so coming back to the book. Is it a mobile? It's not. It might be one. Maybe it's one. Okay, so then to just come back to the book. So this is really, I wanted to present this first to give you a sense of the sort of thinking we've been doing together before I actually came to write this book. And then when I did come to write this book, how I've tried to kind of think about those same questions while also writing a book with only, me as the author. So this book really, I wanted to write, I was actually writing a slightly different book when the full-scale invasion happened, which was kind of more academic. In the traditional sense, kind of detached, and I wasn't in it, and it was kind of trying to assert that authoritative voice where you speak in this universalizing way on behalf of everybody. And then when the full-scale invasion happened, I felt that I couldn't continue with that book, and I wanted to write something that was in conversation with the many people who I'd done this research with, and would feature them and their work, which was amazing, to preserve the heritage of the region that was, at the time I was writing, being destroyed, and the communities who were being displaced from that region. So I tried to do this in various ways. I tried to do it by kind of putting myself in the book and really being very explicit about how I came to kind of know the things that I know, and they were through meetings with local people who told me what they knew, and also kind of reading locally produced historical and cultural sources. So I really wanted to try and like show how important it was to have these encounters with local knowledge holders, some of whom were often not academic, but kind of just enthusiasts for the history and the industrial history and heritage of the region. And so each chapter really has a protagonist from the place, and I kind of tell the history in conversation with the protagonist. So the first chapter is about the mineral history of eastern Ukraine. Obviously, you know, we know that the reason why it's so heavily industrialized is because it's so rich in minerals. So this is sometimes called a resource curse, because this richness that leads to incredible biodiversity and ecological richness also then can lead to extractivism as those resources get plundered by various kinds of capitalist and colonial actors. So I wanted to really get into this kind of the mineral history of the region, because that's really kind of the beginning of the story. I would never have done this if I'd written an academic book, because it's so far outside of the normal area that I would normally work in. But here I wanted to do it, and I wanted to show that this isn't just a region that is you know, rich in coal. It has 3 kinds of coal, but also there are so many other minerals present in the landscape here: chalk, gypsum, salt, which is almost the very beginning of the kind of history of the region, when people came to mine the salt around Tor, today's Toretsk. And this map that you can see on the left, which was produced by the Kharkiv mineralogist Yevgraf Kavalevsky, the petrographic map of the Donetsk mountain range in 1823-27, is really one of the first cartographic attempts to map the mineral resources of this region, which was almost functioned as an invitation to industrialists to then come in and start to extract those resources. So this is the beginning. I see this map as the transformation of this region, as the beginning of the transformation of this region from a fairly negligible territory from the point of view of the imperial center into an extraction resource. This is the transformation of this region into Donbas, the Donetsk coal basin, where like the resources would begin to be strategically extracted by various people. And the person who took me around this region and showed me all of these amazing mineral sites was a man who some of you might know, Mikhailo Kulishov, who features really prominently in this book. He's a historian, a researcher, a cave explorer, somebody who has very many different kinds of professional identities, and probably one of the most knowledgeable people about the industrial history of this region. And he was kind enough to take a lot of time to explain the history of this place, to take me to many of the mines and the caves where you could see these minerals, and to kind of really open up this complex mineral history, which then led to the firstly the colonial expansion to this region in the 1700s by Catherine II, who partly colonized it when she expanded to the sort of south and eastern Ukraine, but also contributed to the interest of foreign industrialists, including the Welsh industrialists in this region, who came at the end of the 19th century and were very active in extracting all of the different kinds of mineral resources. So the British were there developing the coal mines and the ironworks, but you can see in the postcard photograph on the left, the Belgians were also there in huge numbers. In actual fact, there was so much Belgian capital in eastern Ukraine at the end of the 19th century that Donbas was known as the 10th Belgian province. That's what they used to call it. And this is a photograph of Usine Providence, which was a Belgian-funded factory that then ultimately became the Illich factory in Mariupol. And also part of it became the Azovmash factory, and here you can see us walking around the ruins of the Azovmash factory in Mariupol in November 2021. And in this chapter I write in conversation with Andriy, a local industrial enthusiast and collector who knew insane amounts about this history. He was one of these kinds of people who was just a complete kind of industrial heritage nerd, but had like accumulated incredible digitized collections online and wrote about it for various forums and was incredibly well informed, and again somebody who knew these landscapes and who had many times gone to this place and compared the postcard photography with the ruins that you now see and could really kind of bring this place alive and reconstruct it for me when we visited. So this is a chapter that I write in conversation with Andriy. Then I wanted to write about the Soviet history of this region and the way in which kind of it was fetishized in Soviet industrial propaganda, and really the myth of Donbas as a kind of like a sort of flagship, iconic, celebrated region of Soviet industrial modernity, which emerged in the Stalinist 1930s, but also accelerated across the second half of the 20th century, how that still kind of impacted the way in which history and heritage was presented in the place. So this chapter is partly presented in conversation with the director of the Ilyich Iron and Steelworks Museum, who presented the kind of museum to me, and the way in which these sorts of cults of of strike workers and overachieving industrial labourers were still sort of present and celebrated in the museum context, and how these cults were still being reproduced up until 2022. For example, you can see on the right the very popular factory director, Volodymyr Boyko, who there was certainly a cult of him in the city. If any of you are from Mariupol or know about the history, his image was everywhere, and this was a modern version of a kind of the cult of the factory director, which is different, of course, from the cult of the worker, but still is very revealing about how these kinds of industrial visual traditions were still very present up until the period of the full-scale invasion. Chapter 4 was about sort of this Soviet industrial city and the kind of the creation of this kind of monotown model, which is so prominent, and Irina and Volodymyr Kulikov have written a brilliant book about the history of monotowns in eastern Ukraine, and I draw on that in this chapter. But I also wanted to kind of write about how you experience the urban landscape when you go to a place like Severodonetsk, which was a very prototypical monotown, in as much as the factory took up half of the space on the map, and the city was built around the factory. Severodonetsk, as I'm sure you know, was a nitrogen-producing kind of city where a lot of the people who lived and worked in the city were kind of connected with the industry in some way. But the factory hadn't just been a form of employment in Severodonetsk, it was also a provisioning centre, a place that built housing, that built cultural centres, and so it's kind of its connections with the city were very visible throughout, and the industrial infrastructure, even when it was derelict, was still being actively used by people in the town. For example, in the rave that we attended in 2019, where actually kind of chemical symbols were projected up onto the wall in reference to the city's past. And in this chapter, I kind of I wanted to feature this amazing kind of collective of activists who were present in Severodonetsk, who some of you may know, the Plus Minus Art Residency, and Katya Sirik and Alexander Kuchinsky, who were very active in that scene, and who again like kind of showed me a lot around this town and how like they were exploring abandoned industrial buildings and collecting some of the industrial heritage that had been left there as kind of historical trash, and so how that kind of history of the monotown was being kind of engaged and activated up until the full-scale invasion. Also, obviously, part of the history of eastern Ukraine is ecological, and industry had a devastating and damaging effect on local ecologies. So chapter 5, I wanted to talk about some of the kind of specifics of that, and in particular I wanted to talk about the trip I did to Mariupol in November 2021, where I was hosted partly by Sashko Prochak, who's a filmmaker who some of you may know, who one of the founders of the Free Filmers Collective, and he was kind enough to kind of show me around and tell me about some of the kind of the political kind of conditions and also the ecological conditions that people were living with in Mariupol before the full-scale invasion. So we went, for example, to the Azov Sea, which had been hugely impacted by industry. So you can see in the background the very famous kind of slag heap from Azovstal, which kind of went directly into the sea, intoxified the water there and caused all sorts of ecological damage to local ecosystems. But also I had a remarkable trip around Mariupol with a local photographer and steel worker and fisherman called Artem Bereznov, who kind of took me to these places where people fish in the kind of the water that the factory throws out into the river, because the warmth from that kind of cooling water brings shoals of fish in, and even though that water is toxified, then people would still fish in that water because it's an easy catch. And so I with Sashko and Artem, I wanted to tell this story of kind of ecological sort of challenges and the demands of living in a heavily industrialized place whose landscapes are kind of fundamentally compromised by industry. Chapter 6 was about the kind of cultural activism in Eastern Ukraine, which was really obviously one of the most remarkable things. When you come from abroad, the things that you know about Eastern Ukraine are heavy industry and war, but you don't necessarily know that this was one of the most vibrant places for cultural activism in Ukraine at that time, that many people kind of were admiring and wanting to kind of go and see or potentially even get involved in. I know that Mariupol was really well known for kind of the activist work that it was doing, but there were many places like that that I was able to visit and encounter. And when I give this talk in the UK, people often ask the question, oh, but wasn't that all funded by US aid? I've Googled the projects you were talking about, and they're all funded by US aid in the EU, so that probably that's what was going on, and you're not really telling the whole story there. And of course, lots of the projects were funded by US aid, but that doesn't mean at all that they were completely empty-headed sort of robots following instructions from the United States. The people who were present in the activist scene in Eastern Ukraine, I found from my interviews and encounters with them, were very, very able to navigate this complicated funding landscape to do the projects that they wanted to do there. And so this is something that I really try and bring across in this chapter, because I think there's often a very sort of prejudiced idea about, oh, we really know what this region is, and the US tried to make sure that it had this civil society building stuff going on, but actually, was that really true? And then the last chapter is after the full-scale invasion, when actually we came back to Lviv, and we had a workshop here that brought a lot of my colleagues from Eastern Ukraine who I'd been working with for many years already, together to have a kind of big discussion about sort of documentation and heritage preservation. And this is my, now I think I can call him my friend and collaborator, Mikhailo Kulishov on the right, and Zhenya Kalugina, who is a director of the Slovyansk Local History Museum. In this chapter I wanted to really kind of engage the issue of resilience, which is one that gets really kind of used a lot in kind of the media sphere, especially in the West. Oh, the Ukrainians are so resilient, wow, it's amazing what they do, and of course it is. But I think there is a problem with this idea of resilience, that it projects an idea of superhuman capability to cope with suffering onto people in a way that almost absolves the kind of people who don't cope with that situation on a day-to-day basis from responsibility for that suffering. And so I kind of, in this chapter, I wanted to think about resilience and the politics of using that idea to understand what's going on in Ukraine today, and how we might think differently about the way in which people live with kind of constant precarity and exhausting sort of conditions such as war, and nevertheless continue to do the work that they're doing, preserving heritage and working in a cultural sense. And I wanted to include this photo. I asked Misha if he would mind me including this photo, because it's like such a particular one, and he said it was okay if I had to. But I end the book with this anecdote of when we were sitting on the terrace in Lviv, not far from here, and I was talking with Misha about the project work he was now doing to try and kind of create 3D reconstructions of some of the places that had been destroyed in some of the industrial regions that he had worked before. And it was like a devastating, heartbreaking conversation. And then this praying mantis just landed on his t-shirt. And yeah, the praying mantis has a lot of folklore around it. And in some African traditions, it's kind of thought to be like a kind of harbinger of good luck, or can even bring the dead back to life. And it's obviously that isn't the case for Ukraine, and that we continue to be completely devastated by what's going on. But I wanted to kind of end with this image of sort of, I don't know, of heartbreak and hope, life in spite of everything, maybe, which is kind of what kind of drives this book, and why I wanted to write it. So yeah, that's all. So thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Victoria. I think it's very inviting both for discussion and of course for reading the book itself. And yeah, thank you a lot for also explaining some of your approaches to how you wrote what you wrote, how you actually know what you know and what you present there. So I think this is very important to be so self-reflexive, and also to be somehow really given this invitation to the reader to also follow you and really understand not from some very authoritative point of view, but more from this collaborative point of view, and also through experiences of certain places and conversations. It's definitely something very different. And also I have several questions, and I hope that people are also preparing theirs. You said a lot of what I was thinking of asking, but I think I like the title very much, of course, and still for me, I think, and for so many people today, there is also this question about future of this heritage. Of course, there was a lot of challenges before the full-scale invasion too, such as war, deindustrialization, and also lack of prioritization for this inconvenient or sometimes difficult and dark heritage. But I found maybe one of the opportunities and maybe a paradoxical kind of promise for the future in how you approach landscape as heritage, right? Even if you have like the total destruction of built environment, even if the collections are lost and museums are also damaged or looted and people displaced, but still landscape plays a very powerful role in your book, and in a way how you also include many of material actors of your story, and how you show that both like scars and traces in the landscape are always about this interaction between nature and humans. So I think you show it in a very interesting way how sometimes we can think of some objects as purely kind of natural and independent of any human intervention, but most often this is already the result of some interaction which was very deep in this region. If you can maybe comment about what do you think of this landscape as heritage, and what are the opportunities of working with it?
Wow, thanks for that question. Yeah, so I mean, one of the reasons, I'm not sure I thought about it so explicitly like that when I wrote the book, but I was very keen to kind of paint this region for people, for readers, because I think partly in the UK and in Western Europe, it's thought about as this really sort of depressing and bleak, heavily industrialized, heavily polluted place, and of course some parts of it are, but I don't think the complexity, like the kind of environmental complexity, not to mention the historical complexity of this region, is very often well represented to Western English language reading audiences. So one of the things that I really wanted to do was to kind of just very basically show how beautiful it is, how like the landscapes are incredibly enchanting and diverse from these sort of like preserved steppe zones, which have incredible kind of rare flora and fauna, which I had no idea about. You know, the chalk fields, which produce this very specific kind of plant life as well, and also, you know, the many kind of fascinating like seas, like the Azov Sea in Mariupol, which has this very specific environmental character. It's a shallow sea, and so it's one that's very kind of has always been very kind of dense in salt, which then because of industrialization actually shifted, and so then the animal life in that sea were impacted by the result of industry. So I wanted to bring a lot of that to life, to kind of counter this idea that this was only like a hyper-bleak, post-apocalyptic, almost post-life place where war is endlessly going on, and you know, it's just characterized by emptiness. I think maybe that was the real thing. I had this sort of, you know, in the literature about sort of imperialism, emptiness is this really important kind of concept. If a place is empty, then you can colonize it. You know, and that, like, this region of Ukraine was always presented as empty, either as a wild field or as this kind of empty land where nomads roamed, and you know that could be easily colonized and civilized or industrialized, and life was always being brought from elsewhere to this place. But in actual fact, this place thrives with life in because of its environmental and mineral diversity, and you can see that in the landscape. So kind of painting these landscapes and the diversity of the landscapes was partly an anti-imperial practice to kind of dispute this idea of emptiness. And now I think we see the Ukrainian is being depicted as empty again. And of course it's emptying, and displacement and destruction is causing this new kind of emptiness, and that's part of the Russian imperial violence that's happening there. But it's still not empty. It still has all of these different kinds of life that are present in it, albeit damaged and compromised by this awful war. But yeah, so this is part of the reason why I wanted to kind of highlight landscapes and environments in this book, because it was so politically important and has been instrumentalized, the idea of there being nothing there. So this is, I think, part of the thinking behind that choice.
Yeah, thank you. I think now I will put my last question and give the microphone to the audience. So developing on this, like your approach, which was very much, I think, empathetic and sympathetic to the region, and this attempt to really maybe deal somehow with this black legend of the post-industrial places, which you have everywhere in the world, and Donbas was one of them, which had a very strong reputation, and I think your approach was quite like changing it. But also speaking more about more critical aspects of your book, I think it went contrary to the current trend in Ukrainian, at least popular history projects, such as, for example, we were talking just before the presentation about the film by Korniy Gritsuk, Donbas, which I think represents the trend which tries to very much highlight the pre-Soviet history of Donbas as quite a positive civilizational development of the region in quite a bright picture, which actually puts this accent not on the Soviet period, but before it, as a period of prosperity, of being a part of the global world, of developing very quickly, and being a kind of multicultural place. Of course, there are certain critical just mentions about like some unexpected outcomes of this early capitalism in Donbas in Rytsyuk's film. But still, overall, I think this very notion of Euro Donbas is, of course, rather about finding some very positive period in this longer history and giving it this prominent role as a kind of lost Atlantis history, right? So some beautiful civilization which was lost because of the Bolshevik Revolution and so the Stalinization of the region. But in your book you have a much more critical approach to this presence of international capitalism in Donbas and in these traces of like international labor force or kind of Welsh or other entrepreneurs. So you do not really focus on them as some kind of something which can be like most somehow relevant or kind of important. So they are only one of many layers of the past which are there. Didn't you feel a bit uncomfortable maybe in conversations with some of your interlocutors because they were maybe more enthusiastic about this pre-socialism history of the area, but you were more critical? Maybe they were expecting that you will be more like focusing on yours on the Donbas. Was there any kind of maybe misunderstanding because of this?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Yeah, I think actually, so this book has been like well received on the whole, but the only like kind of real savage criticism I got was from a right-wing newspaper in the UK, which said, why is she criticising like British industrial modernity and like our great contribution like to developing the world, like all this academic wokeism, like anti-extractivism, what's all of that about? Which I was quite proud of, obviously. But yeah, I mean, this is, I think, one of the... first off, I totally understand why there would be this desire to recover this European history and heritage in eastern Ukraine, because, you know, Russia has been trying to promote this propagandistic narrative of this place as, like, part of the Ruski Mir, like, always part of, like, a Russian-speaking, sort of, like, you know, pro-Russian, kind of saturated with Russian culture region that was always Russian. You know, this is the dominant narrative that was emanating from Russia and from the occupied territories. So of course there would be a strong desire to find a strong alternative narrative to that Ruski Mir idea, and the European heritage of industry presents a possibility for kind of telling a totally different story about this region. And I totally get why that would be attractive at this moment in time, increasingly so. But I think, you know, it's important to keep a critical lens on this history, because it isn't that it was kind of, you know, philanthropic on the part of the European industrialists to go there and kind of develop the industrial capacities of these places. It was incredibly profitable for them. You know, not all of these people were elites back in Western Europe, but they certainly were much richer by the time they finished with the industrial projects that they pursued there. And it wasn't done like in the spirit of giving back to the local community. It was very sort of segregated, and local workforces which came from all over the Russian Empire were extremely exploited and lived in very poor conditions, which also isn't to say, you know, that they were primitive compared to like the developed Westerners, because as Volodymyr Kulikov always points out when I talk about this, he said you should read some of the memoirs that the local workers wrote about the Welsh people and how drunk they were all the time and all of these terrible things that they got up to. So I think in both ways there was a kind of like an exoticization and a kind of antagonistic relationship. But yeah, I think I understand the reason why there would be a strong interest in this history. And I remember in Lysychansk there was a really strong interest in the Belgian kind of architectural heritage of industry there, which was subsequently damaged and completely destroyed. And you know, there were lots of kinds of engagement. There was also the possibility to do cooperative projects with Western European countries on the basis of this history and heritage, which would create opportunities for funding, which could stimulate cultural life. So that's, for me, you know, completely understandable. So perhaps it's my responsibility as somebody who isn't kind of dealing with all of this sort of political pressure to kind of put the critical lens on it. But I wouldn't insist on that being the only interpretation in conversation with people, because it makes complete sense why you would want to kind of view that history through that lens at that particular moment in time.
Thank you so much, and please, I'm happy to give the mic to you.
Okay, should I use the microphone?
Please only speak on the mic.
Yeah. Sure, so I have a question which is about the idea of life, and life in a really broad sense, when we are talking about territories that are associated with war. All of it actually reminded me of quite a modern discussion about, well, the life in Ukraine during the war. So it is quite a frequent thing to, see a video on Instagram from a Ukrainian city, either Lviv or Kyiv or even Kharkiv, where people are just going around their business or having fun, sitting at a cafe with their friends, and there will be some comment, even from the Ukrainians, about, well, there is a war in the country, why are you having fun? And worst of all, well, when these are foreigners telling, you see, there is no war in Ukraine, they are just taking your money. So I wonder whether in your experience of, well, talking about war in Ukraine to foreigners, did you encounter something like this, and what was your experience of, well, explaining to foreigners that war is not like, when there is war, people just sit in the trenches 24/7, everybody sits in the trenches, and there is no life. I think it's an incredibly hard task to explain to foreigners that, well, not everybody sits in the trenches, but it doesn't mean that there are no tunes falling on our heads. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that question, and so articulate and well put. I think you're right, that is a challenge, and I think even more so, sometimes it's a challenge to represent the reality where life not only doesn't stop, but it actually intensifies and becomes faster, and more cultural production happens, and creativity becomes more urgent, and people working almost much more than they were previously, because there's a sense of existential crisis and urgency and the need to produce all the time content and contribute to a conversation that's going on. I think that is even harder to capture. But I think I tried to do that because this book is mostly about the region before 2022. I tried to kind of demonstrate how the war had kind of accelerated like civic activism, and how it had shifted the political landscape as well, by really in reality stealing the future of lots of people from the younger generation, how then that had kind of radicalized people to kind of get involved in kind of civic activist projects and to start taking matters into their own hands in terms of creating cultural narratives and stories and work that responded to this reality that they were living in. So yeah, particularly in the chapter in which I talk about like the activist movements that were present in most of the towns that I visited, that was kind of what I was trying to emphasize, how war doesn't stop things, but it accelerates stuff. And that's not to romanticize that acceleration either, because obviously it's incredibly exhausting and depleting to be working at that intensity and that pitch constantly, as like I'm sure all of you in this room know. And it's not something that I would ever wish for, but it does create a cultural space that has a vibrancy and a dynamism that's truly shocking and surprising, I think, for anybody who comes to Ukraine for the first time. You're like, oh my God, like this is insanely intense. Life here is so intense, and like beautiful as well. Even despite the horrors and the heartbreak, like the kind of work that people are doing and the kind of creative and activist work that is being produced is incredibly beautiful. And so like to capture that idea of like devastation and death and beauty and kind of creativity is really like complicated because people like to think about things in binaries, like, you know, life's happening somewhere, death's happening somewhere else. But that binary isn't a realistic representation of the reality, as you know much better than I do.
If you don't mind, I will prioritize the student first because this is summer school, but you will be next. Thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to add a small remark on the. You even mentioned that when we think about industry in England, we think of it in terms of neoliberalization and withering of the industry. And I just wanted to add that in Ukraine, as far as I have gotten, as I've seen it, we also think about the withering of Ukrainian industry due to neoliberal policies that entered since the withering of the Soviet state. And not many people, I guess, think in historical terms about John Hughes, nevertheless. But the question that I have is, I guess, about, let's say, about this boiler. I have
suggestion.
I have a guess that they've been making a way across the seas. I guess I come from the from a small town in Zaporizhia region, Berdyansk, which is currently occupied. It is a port town, and there was actually like a residence of John Hughes where he's been living, and hence my assumption that they've been making their way all over there from England by the sea, and somehow making their way from the Azov Sea to the Donbas region, or they've been making this way by the land. This is the first question, and the second one, how they've been making this way. And the second question is, how was, let's say, how discursively, in terms of discourse, how was this, let's say, trip constructed in a sense? How different this journey of British entrepreneurs was different from their, let's say, colonial enterprises in actual British colonies?
How they understood it.
Yeah. Yes, I guess that's my question.
Yeah, no, great questions. Really, really great questions. So I think that definitely the workers travelled by sea, so to Taganrog, and then like to by sort of bullock train or by other kinds of transport across the steppe to eastern Ukraine. And I think the industrial machinery would have travelled the same way, but it was very complicated and it took a long time. So, but it's possible that the kind of expansion of industry to the other regions that you're talking about took place later as well. So it might not have taken place en route, but rather the industry expanded because for example, recently I've been quite interested in the kind of the British capitalist engagement in Kryvyi Rih, which was also part of this story. So they were there as well as many other parts of the former Russian Empire. So like the British were also very present in Bakhmut, for example, for the oil there, and in northern Kazakhstan. So there's this kind of entangled history of industrial modernity, so-called, and like industrial expansion that links the British to all sorts of parts of the world through this kind of collaborative exploitation of territories that were rich in minerals and resources. And the way that this was constructed discursively, I think this is a really good question, and I'd like your help and to kind of invite you to think through it with me, because obviously this isn't necessarily, it's not identical to settler colonialism in the traditional sense that we understand it. So this, you know, Eastern Ukraine wasn't a British colony, but yet British industrialists settled there and they extracted resources from there and they used them for their own economic benefit. So there is a sense of, like, there's some similar, and they lived in a very kind of much more privileged kind of part of the company town that they developed in bungalows, which they also reproduced in various kind of colonial contexts, such as India and other parts of the global south. So many of the features are very similar. The extractivism, the kind of the segregation, the way in which the British elite profited disproportionately by contrast with the local population, but it's not classic settler colonialism. So what term do we use to describe these people? They're not just labour migrants, that's too too neutral a term. There's something more. So capitalist, exploitative capitalists, opportunists, entrepreneurs, that has quite a sort of positive flavour, doesn't it? Entrepreneurs. Pioneers, that's what the British would like to call themselves, of course. But how do we understand? It's a complicated colonial subjectivity, I think, which kind of demonstrates how this inter-imperiality where empires meet, and these complicated things go on that don't necessarily divide easily into binaries. Another thing that I think is interesting when thinking about this history is that the Welsh themselves are internally colonised people. So you have these subjects who have experienced internal colonisation, then producing these kinds of semi-colonial activities, you know, in other parts of the world. So they have both of these subjectivities. It's a complex colonial subjectivity, not just one thing or the other. They're both the perpetrators and the victims of kind of imperialist and extractivist violence. So I find it really helpful to think through the complexity of this when, you know, quite often we sort of slip into quite easy ideas of, like, you know, colonial guilt and innocence.
Вікторія говорить українською дуже добре, тому ви можете задати питання.
Also one small remark, I guess somehow the history repeats itself. There was, in Berdyansk, there was this constructed factory plant, Azmol, during the Soviet times. And it's been withering away since the fall of the Soviet Union, but eventually it became like the British capital once again invested into this factory to produce the oil, I guess it was producing. And now it is also occupied by Russia, so somehow British capital was, let's say, once again by, you get the point.
Yeah, of course, and this minerals deal as well. I mean, I know there are very many different points of view on the minerals deal, but certainly there is a kind of new sort of inter-imperiality that is involved in that, which kind of newly resourcifies, to use Asya Bazdiyeva's term, turns this country into an extraction resource that is for kind of exchange as a commodity between various centres of empire, I would say. So even if Ukraine derives some strategic benefit from that deal, which I can see how it would, there are these same kind of factors at play where inter-imperiality kind of results in the re-resourcification of a place that has historically already been resourcified for many centuries.
Добрий вечір. Я представник того регіону, про який ви написали книжку. Я вам щиро дякую за те, що ви піднімаєте це питання для населення, яке мешкає за кордоном. У мене невеличкі такі питання. Ну, по-перше, чи плануєте ви перекласти цю книгу на українську мову?
Так. Планую, сподіваюсь.
Так, це перше питання. Друге питання. Коли ви їздили по Донбасу, скажіть, будь ласка, як ви прокладали маршрут?
Як прикладали маршрут?
Так. Ну, ви їздили, дивіться, ви згадували Маріуполь, Lysychansk, Сєвєродонецьк, Торецьк, Слов'янськ і таке інше.
Ну, це було, по-першому, я думаю, з колегами, з якими я подорожувала, вони хотіли показати мене дуже цікаві регіони.
Тобто через знайомих колег?
Так, через знайомих колег, тому що вони набагато краще мене знають, що там цікаво. Я можу читати книгу і думати, що так, це було б дуже цікаво подивитися ці регіони, але вони набагато краще мене знають, що цікаво там. І це правда, це частина, це методології, слухати місні дослідники, які знають про історію, про культуру і можуть показати найцікавіші, найважливіші речі в цьому регіону.
Дуже жаль, що не знайшлося таких знайомих у місті Костянтинівка Донецької області. Це дуже цікаве місто, там дуже багато історії і дуже цікаві підйом бельгійського капіталу, вкладення у наше місто. Бо переважна більшість підприємств, великих підприємств, які були збудовані до радянської влади, це були ті місцеві.
Так, це дуже.
От, і ще одне. Туди вкладали навіть прості бельгійці. Я неодноразово бачив акції, які розповсюджували компанії, бельгійські компанії, які вкладали, і це долучалися звичайні бельгійці. Це дуже цікаво.
Так, це дуже.
Я можу вас познайомити з тими людьми, які вам розкажуть значно більше. Дякую.
Дуже приємно. Дякую.
Yeah, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. And my question would be maybe basic to some extent, but I really like the methodological method, in general methodology of working. And I think that it also is helpful not only just in methodological way, but also for the readers here to understand that it's like a personal story which you can feel, which you can, I don't know, see, etc. And my question is actually about the book itself. So is it a general synthetic history of Donbas, but using a non-classical way of writing this general history, and or so to say from the 19th century to today, or it just has a different structure, because you presented a structure and I do not understand actually if I just take this book, so I will read about the general history of the Donbas from the mid of 19th century to today, because it's very interesting methodology, and I think that the biggest challenge here could be, at least as I see it, that it's you can just have so many personal stories, and it's the big challenge how to include so many personal stories, so many personal feelings into one book. So is it a synthetic, so to say, non-classic synthetic history of the Donbas from the mid-19th century till today, or is it something else? It's about the book, very basic question, but I'm really interested in.
I'm not sure it's a basic question. I think it's quite a complicated question. No, I think so. It draws on all of the kind of work, the research that I did in archives and libraries for the academic book that I was planning to write. So it includes some sort of original research that I was conducting. For example, I mean, I sped through very quickly the chapters just to give you a sense of what it's all about. But this chapter, for instance, this one, about worker cults, like draws on research that I did at the Pshenichny archive with Stakhanovite photography, and I intended to write a history of kind of Stakhanovite photography and this region and how it had been kind of sort of how it transformed or not over time, and how these kinds of visual traditions kind of remain very prominent across time. But in the end, because it was a book for a broader audience, I wanted to kind of bring a lot of that sort of historical information into it. But it still has a lot of that original research, which is about which is drawn from archives. But then it's also very entangled with, as I say, this personal experience and conversations with colleagues and friends. So I'd say it's kind of like an undisciplined cultural history, which is kind of, I'm not sure where it fits anymore, to be perfectly honest. But I wanted to definitely kind of make it readable, because it seemed like a political imperative to tell this story to a broader audience and tell it in a way that would be engaging, that people would listen. And to render all of that complexity that you're dealing with, not only kind of the complexity of entangled empires, and the fact that this region was at the intersection of several empires, so it's not only multinational and multilingual, but also has all of these different kinds of sort of political histories embedded in its landscape. To render that in a way that that kind of broader audiences would understand was quite a challenge. So I think that kind of doing it in this way, where it's in kind of conversation with people and often kind of rooted in these encounters with the landscape, was a way in which I could try and bring all of that complicated history to readers at a time when it was really important to understand complexity and not just kind of collapse into stereotypes about this place. So maybe it is a synthetic history. I never quite know what my Ukrainian colleagues use this word synthetic history quite a lot, and I'm never quite sure what you mean by it. It seems like quite a negative term often, but it doesn't mean like simplistic, like a kind of simplistic telling of a story. Probably is, but I wanted to tell it in a simplistic way so that people would actually read it and kind of try and understand some of the complexity. If I told it in a very complex, academically kind of academically sort of ambitious, conceptually high-minded way, probably very few people would want to read it, only my academic colleagues. So I wanted to tell it in a simple way because I wanted it to actually resonate, and for the emotional kind of content, like mine and that of other people, when expressing their love and their passion for this place that they'd spent all their life, and then their devastation of being like displaced from it, actually resonated with readers. And to do that, sometimes you have to write in a different way.
Thank you so much for your talk. I really also appreciated the dive into methodology initially. My question is about going back to this methodology, and you kind of touch on art making as a way of kind of opening up spaces for collaboration and fostering kind of non-extractive modes of thinking and making. And I was hoping you could speak a little bit about what your conversations were like in terms of also kind of fostering these non-extractive art practices, because the cultural production also is entangled in all of these kind of potentially extractive logics, histories of photography as well. And so I'm curious, in kind of your own development of your work and research, like shifting between art and writing and working with these different collaborators, what kinds of things were coming to mind, or what kind of conversations were you having around developing those non-extractive practices in these different
Thanks for that question. It gives me a good excuse just to to take the conversation away from Ukraine for a moment and talk about the UK, because this is one of the places where we use these artistic methods. And I think it's really important to kind of insist on the fact that collaborative methods aren't always harmonious at all, and you have these same kind of tensions that emerge around positionality and privilege emerging when you try and do collaborative projects. I think we often want to present collaborative work as really heartwarming and positive and anti-extractivist, and kind of sort of present it as a good thing to do. But it's complicated, and it often involves conflict, even when you're trying to collaborate. So this project, for example, which I did in West Lothian in Scotland, with young people it was just after COVID as well, so lots of young people had been at home for a really long time. And we took cameras and we climbed these slag heaps in West Lothian and collected flowers from the slag heaps, because these are oil shelf slag heaps, which are the oil shells heated really hot, and then the actual slag becomes chemically neutral, so that it's not toxic in the same way as coal slag heaps are. And you actually have all of these really crazy flowers growing on there that don't grow in other places, because basically it has the ecosystem of a desert. So you have opium poppies growing on them, for example, like in Afghanistan. And so we went and picked these flowers and we made these cyanotypes. But I'm not from that region, and I come from like a really posh university, or one that's kind of has this kind of bad reputation from being a posh university. And I could see that the teenagers were like, "Who are you?" Coming to talk to me about this, about our slag heaps, what on earth. And I worked with a local arts educator there, but still there was this dynamic where I could constantly feel that I was like this outsider who was present trying to do this thing. But you had to navigate that quite complicated ethical landscape and try and do sort of not actually confirm their suspicions, that you were just like there to exoticize them and to kind of put something on a form and say, I did this public engagement project, yeah, well done me. But it was like, we worked for like 4 weeks with these teenagers, and like it was, now I'm going to do the thing where I romanticize it and say it's amazing, but it was I think one of the highlights of my career to do that. Actually, we produced this beautiful art. It felt so meaningful because like lots of them actually went on to like apply for programs in the university, and like so we managed to shift this idea of like the university being this privileged space, which would like evidently exclude them. Some of them like did internships at the Oil Shale Museum afterwards, and it was like I think a really amazing project that like kind of was difficult to realise, but also was worth it, because then like, you know, just you kind of like know when people have enjoyed stuff and got something out of it. So I think, yeah, you do work with like arts methods, like they are tricky and difficult, and they involve lots of thinking through and lots of difficult conversations, and you have to prove yourself, it has to be sustainable, it has to be long term. You can't just go in and do something with a community and then like, you know, win their respect and admiration. It doesn't work like that. It's got to be like a slowly built up relationship of mutual trust, and then I think you can do like really meaningful stuff. But it is again coming back to this kind of question about labour and depletion. It's really hard work, and it isn't always necessarily like recognised by institutions like universities as valuable work. Like, you know, it might be thought of more as like social work rather than proper academic work, you know, the stuff that we're supposed to be doing, pioneering new kinds of knowledge. Like, why are you kind of doing all of this sort of weird stuff, like with like making pictures, when you should be, you know, leading the world in terms of like producing new conceptual paths and groundbreaking knowledge. So I think it's a tricky thing, because you know, it's beautiful work, but it's also exhausting work. It's under-resourced. It can be institutionally totally ignored, and then, you know, especially like I'm at one stage of my career, but if you're an early career researcher, is this where you're going to place all of your energy if you're trying to get on in an academic job? So there are many kinds of political kind of questions, I think, that have to be considered. So you're right to like ask that question, and it's something I also think about a lot.
I think we should collect maybe the questions we have.
Thank you, Victoria, for your attentive and conscious work. I have 2 questions. First is about terminology, I think, emphasizing Ukrainianist, avoiding term Donbas. But if you're using this term, I want to ask you where Ukrainian East ends. I mean, Ukrainian East can be like Zaporizhzhia Oblast, Kharkivsk Oblast, parts of Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. Yeah, it's the first one. And second one is you speaking about, in the book you're writing about Ukrainian East free from Russian occupation before 2022, and what place in your book have occupied Ukrainian East, and yeah, do you writing about connections, for example, between people on not occupied territories and occupied territories? Thank you.
Are there any other questions? I think there's... Okay, 2 more. So Natalia and Linda.
Thanks. My question is partially informed by the comment about Konstantinivka and certain things which we see or do not see when we are working with local expertise and local guides. So my question is about this network that you access and those that might not be visible for you because of your local guides, this expertise on the ground, and what are the possible pitfalls of relying on this local expertise, and probably also this conflict that happen on the ground, that you might know some of the actors but do not know the others. precisely because of this tension that happened with this expertise on the ground. I do remember an interview with one of the former actresses from Donetsk theater, and she spoke about these marvelous resources that were there. And I'm thinking about Rihanna's concert at the Donbas Arena and other thriving cultural life that happened because of the lots of resources that were in the region. So I'm also wondering about this part of the story, because I think that some of your guides, they are mostly from, well, kind of, I'm not sure about alternative, but rather not state-funded and not as resourceful as were some of the cultural institutions in the region, at least before the war in 2014 started. So I'm wondering about this possible conflicts and tension that happen on the field, and also the role of money there, not only US aid, but also those local oligarchs who supported certain cultural projects also with their resources. So a little bit about that. Do you have it in the book? Do you reflect on that? And I'm really curious.
Thank you, Victoria. I feel like there are so many questions to collect already, but my question is kind of follow-up to the previous one in your example with these teenagers from Scotland. So, but when you think back of the Ukrainians with whom you collaborated, either for the artistic projects or for the archiving projects, what were their reflections at how did this experience and if changed their thinking and approaching to the industrial histories and the local industries? What kind of impacts these projects might have had for the local communities?
Well, such a lot of questions. I'm not going to be able to do them enough service, but Sasha, thank you so much for the question. So yeah, you're quite right. So in the introduction to the book, I discuss the kind of fraught politics of this term Donbas, which is obviously a term that is introduced as a result of the transformation of this region into an industrial extraction resource. So first used in the kind of the first half of the 19th century, and one that really marks the beginning of this history of the region's development as a kind of industrial kind of engine for other kind of parts of the world. But also one which was heavily instrumentalized in Soviet propaganda and then toxified after 2014 by association with the fighting groups in the occupied territories, and still remains a term that is very kind of politically charged, but yet is one that people from the region would also use to refer to home and to the places that they come from. So it has this complex, entangled kind of meaning associated with it, and I discussed that at some length in the introduction because it troubled me if I could use it or not, and I do use it in the book, but in the knowledge of that complexity, and not with the intention of kind of being offensive or doing harm to the region, but because a lot of the people who I kind of worked with there would use that term to refer to the region themselves. But yeah. And I remember when I kind of called it Ukrainian East, then my PhD student was like, it should be Ukraine's East. And I was like, oh, right, okay. And then, of course, we have similar conversations about whether it's Northern Ireland or Ireland's North, which are also politically charged in the same way. And so, this conversation about how to refer to this region and if one should even refer to it at all, or if even writing a book like this contributes to the idea of that region being unique and special and separate in some way, historically and culturally from the rest of Ukraine, is politically problematic. All of those things kind of are on my mind, but I don't think that the story of this region is unique. I think they're putting it into transnational kind of dialogue with other industrialized regions. You see that it's very common actually to have this kind of history, albeit specific things are happening there now which aren't happening in other parts of the world, like post-industrial and post-industrial regions of the UK. Still many of the same political dynamics are at play. I forgot your second question.
About occupation and how
occupation,
yeah.
No, unfortunately I never got to travel to the territories that were occupied in 2014 because I began my work in 2016. And in a sense that the kind of interest and the funding made available to do these projects, which we did together, was a consequence of the war starting. So, you know, that in a sense kind of like generates this sort of economy that kind of incentivizes people to work in this region, both as activists and as researchers. But, you know, I never obviously traveled to the occupied regions, and so I didn't feel that I could necessarily write about them with authority in the way that I wanted to write the book, although the book does open with a conversation with two people who are travelling to Luhansk on the train, and who kind of I was sharing a carriage with, and who were kind of telling me how great it was to live there, and how like the city is full and like bursting with life and this kind of thing, and how sort of, you know, I was on the train with my friend who was displaced from Luhansk in 2014, and how kind of his experience of being displaced from that city and leaving behind his home contrasted so sharply with the way in which these women in the train carriage were trying to present that place to me. So I think, you know, the occupied territories are present in almost like a shadow sense in a lot of the stories that I'm telling. One of the places that I visited was Toretsk, which was kind of 10 kilometers from the front line at that time. And there you could really feel the presence of I'm sure many of you know, the war that had kind of devastated the opportunities for economic investment in the city. It had one of the oldest coal mines, I think the oldest coal mine in the region was there, and it was really incredibly dangerous, and people were working in these really very precarious conditions, but nobody would invest in that place because, you know, as happened, the war expanded, and you know, they would have lost all their money, and so there was just no interest in doing that. So you feel the impact of the presence of, like, the proximity of the occupied territories, but unfortunately I didn't get a chance ever to kind of work with people from there, so couldn't really include them in the story. Natasha's question, good question, of course. Yes, of course, there are risks of like partial representation when you speak to people in this way or kind of work through networks, although scholars often work with such snowballing methodologies and don't necessarily present their work as partial. I think, you know, I'm quite honest that this is quite a partial history. I think all academic research is partial in a way that we often don't want to admit. And so in that way I'm very kind of much aligned with scholars like Donna Haraway, who like really assert the kind of reality of situated knowledges. We can't speak on behalf of everything and on behalf of everyone, and we shouldn't pretend that we should. This universalizing academic voice, I think, can be quite damaging, and the assertion that, you know, we have the ability to kind of speak with complete objectivity is also, I think, problematic, and, you know, increasingly we're questioning that in kind of contexts, including kind of decolonial research contexts. So, you know, it's something that we have to think about, but at the same time, you know, embodied knowledge on the ground isn't always like totally 100% authoritative either. People represent their histories partially and with political prejudice and with particular points of view. So in a sense, you know, the fact that I had done some kind of traditional academic research in archives and libraries, but also wanted to entangle that with the stories that people were telling me, was sort of a kind of mixed methods approach, which kind of recognises partiality, but also tries to kind of use some of the more traditional methods to get a kind of a richer sort of source base to kind of speak from. And was that was your question, right?
Money.
Money. Yes. What was it about money again? So
as about this distribution of funding, also related to cultural developments in the region, not only about USA but also about local money.
Yeah. Yeah, of course. I think, but I wouldn't say that necessarily all of my interlocutors were like from this kind of hipster sort of like funded scene. So Artem, for example, was the head of a workshop in the steel making factory in Mariupol. And I think a lot of people, you know, they were kind of working class people from like kind of mining families, and I think there was quite a kind of range of people who I spoke to. The director of the Mariupol Iron and Steelworks Museum was quite a particular character, was quite a different point of view to some of the sort of more people who are more involved in civic activism. So I think there are different kinds of points of view represented in the book, not just those that were kind of powered by either Western or oligarchic capital funding, albeit I do really want to kind of highlight, because I feel strongly about this and it comes up and talks a lot, that the funding landscape doesn't dictate the political outlook of the people and the projects and the work that they want to realise in the regions. You know, it can support it, but I like my strong feeling kind of talking to people was that they were realising the projects they wanted to realise with that money or not. A lot of the time, like, it was done voluntarily or with a very, very shoestring small budget, but the work isn't dictated by the flow of capital, I don't think, and we have to be a bit cautious about that when we're taking this kind of leftist critique of how kind of cultural politics in that region and others like develops, I do feel. And then Linda's question about how people responded, well, maybe you could answer that one, because you did a lot of the, I can talk about the UK, but you did a lot of the workshops in Ukraine, albeit sometimes in collaboration with me, but maybe you'd like to have a word.
Yeah, actually how people responded to the activities, I think like part of it was that we actually shared not only authority but work. And people really worked a lot for our project. For example, creating archival descriptions of the objects we collected, not only like sharing their comments or life stories, for example, or donating objects or giving their very private and sometimes intimate things to digitize. But I think what was probably the strongest way of engagement, not only like visiting an event or giving some feedback, but more really like taking part of the workload of this project. And some of the people really were so much generous in contributing their time and really sitting hard on the computers. And for example, like Yevhen Fialko, who really worked a lot on these Excel tables, just filling in the fields and describing his own collection. So I think that's actually why maybe we were also recognized by this European Heritage Award, Europa Nostra. I think that's for actual public outreach and community engagement, because I think really one of the strongest engagements is a kind of co-creation, not only in some maybe artistic workshop or event, but really this day-by-day engagement when people were really like working with us together. Oh, thank you so much. I think it was a very intensive and very interesting conversation. And yeah, thank you all for contribution, and thank you, Victoria, for sharing and for your book.
Yeah, thanks for the questions. Yeah.
Yes.